We couldn't talk this much about culture without talking about culture shock. Culture shock is what happens whenever we become overwhelmed by the anxiety that comes from losing all familiar landmarks and symbols of social intercourse. We find ourselves thrust into an alien culture and everything is different, and we can become overwhelmed by that. That's called culture shock. And culture shock can be a barrier to communication. It can cause us to feel insecure. It can cause us to feel unsure of ourselves. And it can cause us to develop feelings of helplessness and lowered self-esteem and a desire to go home and get out of it and just leave behind the whole venture, a desire just to cut off the communication. And so we want to be aware of what culture shock is, because it can affect our ability to communicate with other cultures. A final barrier to intercultural understanding is ethnocentrism. That's the belief that one's own culture is superior to all other cultures, and it's the tendency to judge all other cultures by one's own criteria. Although it may be natural to believe that anything different is wrong, that is not a very productive attitude. Blaming people for not behaving the same way we do is irrational, especially when economical or physical factors may explain the differences between the way we act and the way they act. Now, what if a ministry opportunity opens up for you and you're able to go to a foreign country in a foreign culture and become a missionary or a church worker or some other kind of ministry opportunity? What happens then? If you go overseas, if you leave your home country and go to a new strange land and a new strange culture, there are going to be some barriers that you're going to have to overcome to adapt to that culture. If you're going to communicate effectively in that culture, you have to learn to assimilate into that culture. And so you have to understand there's some very simple barriers that exist. The first barrier to adapting to a new culture is cultural distance. That is the extent to which your cultures are different. And that comes into play. There's a difference in between moving from Missouri to Iran, where there's a vast cultural distance or difference between the cultures, or moving from Missouri to England, where the cultural difference is not as vast. We speak the same language. We may pronounce words a little differently, but we communicate very well. And we have a Western mindset and a Western worldview, and we tend to look at things much the same way. And so there's not as much distance between that culture and ours as there is between Asia or the Middle East or some other, maybe somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. There are differences in our cultures that are more vast. And if you're going to adapt to the culture, you have to be aware of the cultural distance in between your culture and the culture that you're going to be ministering in, you're going to be working in, and you have to work to overcome those differences. The general rule of thumb is that the more different cultures are, the more cultural distance that there is, the more difficult it's going to be to achieve successful intercultural communication. The second factor related to intercultural interaction, if you were to move into a new culture, is your own personality. Whether or not you're open to change, whether or not you have a high self-esteem, if you have a low tolerance for ambiguity, if you find being an outsider distressing, if you lack confidence, you're going to have trouble in a culture until you assimilate, because you're going to be an outsider. You're going to be alone, and you're not going to have your familiar support structure around you. And so the way that we overcome that is we learn as much as we can about the culture ahead of time. We invest ourselves in learning a language. We invest ourselves in learning cultural norms. It's normal in Asia for a visitor to bring a gift, and it is absolutely a rule that a visitor takes off their shoes before entering a home. And if you familiarize yourself with those things ahead of time, it helps you overcome. It helps you be prepared personally, your personality, to be prepared to overcome the cultural distance, and it'll make you a better intercultural communicator. The third and final factor that affects successful intercultural communication is the way that you interact with your host culture. Whether or not you can have an openness or a confidence to embrace that culture, whether or not there's an internal predisposition against that culture. You have to work through all those things. And the best way to become an effective intercultural communicator is to become an open communicator. An open communication style is a key variable to successful adaptation to a new culture. If you want to learn to be a more open communicator, the chapter in your book ends with a brief list of ways that you can become a better open communicator. The first one is this: open yourself to new contact. If you're trying to communicate with a new culture, you need to make acquaintances in that culture. You need to become familiar with and develop friendship or relationship with people in that culture, because it'll help disconfirm negative expectations about the culture, and it'll help you discover that they aren't all alike. They're not all the same. And another way that you can increase your ability to be an open communicator is rid yourself of harmful stereotypes, prejudices, and stereotypes that may have been impressed upon you by your own culture can inhibit your ability to communicate interculturally. And so you need to take stock of yourself. Another way that you can become a more better open communicator is to be open to risk-taking, open to seeing the world from somebody else's perspective. Taking another person's viewpoint, trying to understand the differences between the culture. Those and other ideas are what your book gives at the end of the chapter about how to become a more open communicator. And that's going to wrap up this week's lecture. I will post review questions online. The discussion our discussion topic is already live. And this wraps up week 12, chapter 12, final chapter of the book. Don't forget there's a test upcoming next week that's going to cover chapters 9, 10, and 11. Chapter 12 and next week's material, which is the appendix in the back of the book, those things are going to appear on the final, along with some overview questions from the previous chapters. But I'll be sure to give you a good solid review before that test. Now, next week's lecture will contain a review for this test, Unit 4 test, chapters 9, 10, and 11. Be already getting prepared for that, looking forward to that. You can pull together the review questions are already online for all three of those chapters, and you can look through those and start gathering that information and studying it so that you'll be successful in the test. God bless you. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week.